Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the sound of water gently lapping against stone, the faint call of distant birds, and the golden light of dawn rising over a city built upon a shimmering lake. Welcome, my friend. Tonight, we will journey together into the world of the Mexica, better known as the Aztecs, a people who rose from humble wanderers to rulers of one of the most magnificent cities ever seen, and who fell in a clash of worlds that changed history forever. Over the course of this story, we'll walk their markets, listen to their festivals, feel the rhythm of their drums, and witness the rise and fall of Tenochtitlan, the city of the sun and lake. Before we begin, I invite you to take a moment to settle in. Find a comfortable place, let your shoulders relax, and let your breath slow down. This is your time to unwind and allow history to gently guide you toward rest. If you enjoy journeys like this one, please consider supporting the channel by leaving a like and subscribing. It truly helps us continue creating these long, calming stories for you. And I'd love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. Now, let the waters of the lake surround you. Let the drums of Tenochtitlan echo softly in the distance, and let us begin our story of the rise and fall of the Aztec Empire. Part 1. From Wanderers to Warriors. The story of the Aztecs does not begin with stone pyramids or golden cities. It begins with a people adrift. The Mexica, as they called themselves, were wanderers without a home. They carried only their gods, their language, and a prophecy that somewhere, someday, they would find a place promised to them. For centuries they moved across the valleys and plains of central Mexico, seeking a sign that seemed as distant as the stars above. According to their own traditions, their journey began far to the north in a semi-mythical land called Aztlan. The name would one day echo in Aztec, the word used by outsiders to describe them, but to the Mexica it was more than geography. It was a place of origin, a memory of beginnings. Legends say they left Aztlan under the guidance of Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war, who demanded they keep moving until he revealed their destined homeland. The journey was not gentle. As migrants, they were often unwelcome. The valleys of central Mexico were already dotted with powerful city-states, Culhuacan, Texcoco, and many others with ancient lineages and proud traditions. The Mexica, arriving with few possessions and foreign ways, were treated with suspicion. They sometimes found temporary refuge as mercenaries, fighting wars for others. They worked as hired blades in exchange for food and land, proving their worth through courage and ferocity. Yet they were never fully embraced. To many, they were outsiders, useful in times of conflict but always viewed with distrust. Still, they endured. Their devotion to Huitzilopochtli grew sharper with each hardship. If they were mocked for their rough manners or denied fertile land, they believed it was a test from their god. If they were pushed into swamps and barren ground, they saw not punishment but a trial of faith. These struggles forged a character of resilience. In a world of rival kingdoms and shifting alliances, the Mexica learned to survive on the margins, to wait for opportunity, and to harden themselves for the day destiny would call. The sign they sought was clear in prophecy, an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. It was a vision that might seem simple to us, yet to them it was cosmic. The eagle was the sun, the cactus the earth, the serpent the powers of darkness. To see them united was to witness the triumph of light over chaos, the assurance that the god of war had chosen this place for his people. Until that vision appeared, they would remain restless. Generations passed in this state of wandering. They built camps, then abandoned them. They fought as allies, then moved on again. In Culhuacan, they once found acceptance, even intermarrying with local nobility. But their customs, particularly their ritual sacrifices, horrified their hosts, and soon they were expelled once more. Stories tell of humiliation and desperate retreats through hostile territory, the Mexica carrying their idols on their backs, clinging to faith though everything else seemed to fail them. Then, sometime in the early 14th century, their long journey reached its climax. On a swampy island in Lake Texcoco, they saw it, the eagle perched on a prickly pear cactus, wings wide, clutching a serpent in its beak. To them, this was no ordinary bird. It was the living promise of their god. Against all odds, they had found the place where they were meant to remain. It was not the kind of land others would have envied. Much of it was marsh and shallow water, surrounded by reeds and mud. Farming was difficult. The ground was unstable. Yet the Mexica saw not weakness but opportunity. Where others saw only swamps, they saw the foundation of a city unlike any other. They would build on water, carving canals and raising floating fields, forcing nature itself to yield to their vision. They named their city Tenochtitlan, the place of the prickly pear cactus. At first it was humble, huts of reeds, rough causeways linking small islands, altars of stone where offerings were laid. But from these unpromising beginnings grew what would one day be the most dazzling city of the Americas, a metropolis that would astonish Europeans when they first beheld it. The founding of Tenochtitlan was not just about survival, it was about transformation. The Mexica were no longer wanderers. They were rooted now, tied to a sacred geography. Their god had placed them in the very center of the Valley of Mexico, where lakes stretched like mirrors and volcanoes loomed against the horizon. Here, they could look outward to trade routes, fertile valleys, and rival city-states that would become both enemies and allies. Geography had given them not only a home but a stage for ambition. Even so, their early years in Tenochtitlan were precarious. They remained a small and vulnerable group surrounded by stronger powers. To secure their existence, they relied on two skills they had refined during their years of wandering: resilience in hardship and ferocity in battle. They offered their swords to larger kingdoms, fought with a reputation for relentless bravery, and slowly carved out autonomy. Every victory, no matter how small, added to their confidence that they were favored by destiny. Religion continued to shape every step. The god Huitzilopochtli demanded sacrifice, and the Mexica believed their survival depended on fulfilling that demand. They captured prisoners in war and offered them to the sun, ensuring that the cosmic balance was maintained. To outsiders, this made them both feared and hated. But within the Mexica worldview, these acts were necessary. Without blood, the sun might falter, the world might collapse. They bore the weight of sustaining the universe itself, and in that duty, they found both purpose and justification for their rise. Slowly, alliances began to shift. The Mexica learned diplomacy as well as warfare. They negotiated marriages with noble families, secured tributary relationships, and built networks that stretched beyond their swampy island. Tenochtitlan grew stronger. Canals were dug, temples were raised, and chinampas, artificial islands for farming, spread across the lake, turning mud into fertile gardens that could feed a growing population. By the 15th century, the Mexica were no longer merely surviving. They were transforming into conquerors. From wanderers cast aside by others, they had become warriors with a sacred city, determined to extend their power. Their rise was only beginning, but the shape of empire was already visible. The prophecy had been fulfilled, and with it came the conviction that they were destined for greatness. For the Mexica, every hardship had been a crucible. Every exile, every rejection, every desperate night on the move had prepared them for this moment. They had emerged from wandering as a people hardened by struggle and inspired by vision. The swamp had become their foundation, the eagle their standard, and the city their beating heart. From here, the story of the Aztec Empire would surge forward with unstoppable energy. Wars would be fought, pyramids raised, markets filled with riches, and the Valley of Mexico transformed into the core of a mighty dominion. Yet at its core, the memory of wandering would never be forgotten. The Mexica would always carry with them the knowledge of what it meant to be outsiders, driven by faith, until the day they found the eagle on the cactus and claimed their place in the world. Part 2. City of the Sun and Lake. When the Mexica first pressed their feet into the mud of the swampy island in Lake Texcoco, they were not stepping into comfort. They were stepping into a challenge. The waters stretched out like a mirror of the sky, reflecting the distant snow-capped peaks of Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl. Reeds swayed in the wind, and birds skimmed across the shallows. Beneath the surface, fish darted among tangled roots, and frogs croaked in the evening stillness. It was beautiful, but it was also harsh. The soil was too soft for sturdy houses, the waters too deep for easy fields. And yet, here, the Mexica began to build their city. At first, Tenochtitlan was a scattering of reed huts raised on stakes, fragile shelters against the lake's shifting ground. The people moved carefully along narrow causeways of mud and woven brush, their steps uncertain, their future even more so. But the Mexica were used to making the impossible possible. With the same resolve that had carried them through centuries of wandering, they began to turn water into land. The key to survival was invention. From mud and reeds, they created chinampas, floating fields that would become the foundation of their agriculture. Workers drove stakes into the shallow lake bed, lashing them together with woven reeds to form rectangular enclosures. Into these frames they piled layers of mud dredged from the lake, rich with silt and nutrients. Over time, the weight pressed downward, and the chinampas anchored themselves to the bottom, turning from floating mats into fertile islands. Along the edges, they planted willow trees, whose roots bound the soil and held the islands in place. In this way, the Mexica multiplied their land, transforming the lake itself into a vast checkerboard of green gardens. On these chinampas grew maize, beans, squash, chilies, and flowers. The crops flourished in the wet soil, and canals between the plots allowed easy irrigation. Canoes could glide silently through the waterways, carrying farmers, tools, and baskets of produce. From the air, had one been able to look down, the scene would have resembled a tapestry. Strips of vivid green land floating on shimmering blue water, stitched together by straight dark canals. It was a landscape crafted by human hands, as beautiful as it was practical. As the fields spread, so did the city. The Mexica built causeways of earth and stone to connect Tenochtitlan with the lakeshore. These causeways were more than paths. They were lifelines, carrying traders, tribute, and armies into and out of the city. Bridges along them could be lifted to block enemies or allow canoes to pass. In this way, the city was at once connected and protected, open to commerce but defended against invasion. Within the city itself, construction grew more ambitious. Wooden huts gave way to stone houses. Markets appeared, gathering places for merchants and farmers. Temples rose from platforms of cut stone, reaching toward the sky. At the heart of it all stood the beginnings of the Great Temple, a pyramid of stone that would be expanded and rebuilt over generations, becoming the sacred axis of the Mexica world. Life in Tenochtitlan began to take on a rhythm. At dawn, farmers pushed their canoes into the canals, heading toward their chinampas where they bent over the earth with obsidian-bladed tools. In the markets, women laid out baskets of beans, maize, peppers, and woven cloth, their voices carrying across the plaza as buyers haggled and exchanged cacao beans, the currency of daily trade. Children played in the alleys, chasing each other between houses and learning the tasks of their parents. Religion infused every detail. Priests, clad in black robes, walked the steps of the temples, chanting prayers to the gods. Smoke from burning copal resin rose into the morning air, curling upward in thin streams, carrying offerings of fragrance to the heavens. At festivals, the city pulsed with sound, drums thundering like heartbeats, flutes wailing, conch shells blaring as dancers in feathered costumes spun in the plazas. Though still small compared to older city-states, Tenochtitlan held something unique. It was not only a settlement, it was a symbol of prophecy fulfilled. The eagle on the cactus was more than a memory. It was embodied in every stone laid, every chinampa raised from the mud, every canal dug through the marsh. The city itself was proof that the Mexica were chosen. As the decades passed, Tenochtitlan began to dazzle outsiders. Merchants from distant towns brought salt, obsidian, feathers, cacao, and cotton. They marveled at the order of the streets, the abundance of the markets, the strange beauty of gardens floating on water. To walk into Tenochtitlan was to step into a place unlike any other in the Valley of Mexico. A city that seemed to grow not on land but out of the lake itself, a vision shimmering between earth and sky. The Mexica themselves felt the weight of transformation. Only a few generations earlier they had been outcasts, scorned mercenaries, wanderers driven from city to city. Now they were builders, creators of a capital that grew stronger with each passing year. The swamp had become their foundation, and the lake their ally. In its waters they saw not obstacles but possibilities. The sun was central to their vision. Each day as its light struck the lake, turning water into silver and gold, the Mexica felt themselves aligned with the cosmos. Huitzilopochtli, the sun god and patron of war, was believed to dwell at the heart of their city, his presence manifest in the great temple. To serve him was to serve the order of the universe itself. As Tenochtitlan expanded, so too did their devotion. The city was more than a capital, it was a sacred place, a city of the sun rising from the lake, destined to shine brighter with each generation. For the children born in Tenochtitlan, there was no memory of wandering. Their world was one of canals and gardens, markets and temples. They grew up hearing stories of Aztlan and the journey of their ancestors, but to them, the city was permanent, a stone reality in the middle of the water. They were heirs not of exile but of destiny. This shift was crucial. With stability came ambition. The Mexica began to look beyond the lake, toward the neighboring city-states that had once scorned them. If they had built so much from swamps and mud, what might they accomplish with control of fertile valleys and established trade routes? The answer, they believed, was empire. Tenochtitlan was still young, but already it pulsed with energy. The sun shone on its temples, the canals glimmered with canoes, and the chinampas bloomed with maize and flowers. A city had risen from water, and with it a people transformed themselves from wanderers into rulers. The stage was set for conquest, glory, and the heights of power. Part 3. Gods Who Demand. To walk the streets of Tenochtitlan was to live in the presence of gods. They were not distant figures imagined in quiet prayer. They were everywhere. Their images looked out from painted murals, carved idols, and embroidered banners. Their names were invoked before planting maize, before setting sail in a canoe, before going to war. In the Aztec world, the divine was woven into every rhythm of existence, and the people believed the very balance of the universe depended on their devotion. At the heart of this belief stood Huitzilopochtli, the sun god and patron of war, the one who had guided the Mexica on their long migration. He was fierce and demanding, a deity of fire and struggle. Without him, the sun would falter, and darkness would claim the world. His image loomed over the great temple in Tenochtitlan, where priests carried out rituals to nourish his strength. Each dawn was considered a victory for him, but only a temporary one, for the battle of day against night was never-ending. The people's task was to give him the fuel he required to keep rising. But Huitzilopochtli was not alone. The Aztec pantheon was vast, filled with gods that reflected every corner of the natural and human world. Tlaloc, the rain god, was as vital as the sun, for without rain the chinampas would dry and the maize wither. His face was painted with fangs and circles around the eyes, both terrifying and generous. Temples to Tlaloc stood beside those of Huitzilopochtli, for sun and rain together made life possible. Then there was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, bringer of knowledge and culture. To some he was the god who gave maize to humankind, who taught the arts of writing and the order of the calendar. His image, plumed and serpentine, stretched back to ancient civilizations long before the Mexica, a reminder that their world was part of a greater Mesoamerican tapestry. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, stood as another powerful figure. A god of fate, sorcery, and change, he was both creator and destroyer, a reminder of the unpredictability of life. He was a deity of the night sky, a shadowy counterpart to Huitzilopochtli's sun. His obsidian mirror reflected not only the future but also the darker aspects of existence, the trials that could befall both ruler and commoner. There were also countless other gods tied to specific aspects of life. Xipe-Totec, the flayed lord of renewal, linked to fertility and new vegetation. Chicomicoatl, the maize goddess, and Mictlantecuhtli, the lady of death who ruled the underworld. To the Aztecs, the cosmos was alive with divine forces. Every harvest, every storm, every heartbeat was entangled in their will. Underlying all these gods was a vision of the universe shaped by struggle. The Aztecs believed the world had been created and destroyed multiple times. In their mythology, we live in the fifth sun, the fifth era of creation. The first four suns had each perished, one consumed by jaguars, another by fiery winds, another by floods, another by darkness. Each collapse had come when the gods failed to sustain the balance. To prevent the same fate from befalling the fifth sun, constant nourishment was needed. That nourishment was blood. Here lies the core of the Aztec religious worldview. Sacrifice was not cruelty, nor a choice of rulers eager to terrorize subjects. It was necessity. Without it, the sun would die, the rains would fail, the earth would collapse into chaos. The gods had bled themselves to create humankind. In return, humankind had to bleed for the gods. It was a cosmic exchange, binding mortals to immortals in an endless cycle of giving and taking. Sacrifice took many forms. Offerings of flowers, food, and incense were common. Children and adults might pierce their ears, tongues, or skin, letting drops of blood fall as gifts to the divine. But the most dramatic offerings were human lives taken in ritual. Prisoners captured in battle were brought to the steps of temples. There, amid drums and chants, they were laid upon stone altars, and their hearts were lifted toward the sky, still beating, still warm, as a gift to the sun. To the Aztecs, this was not an act of cruelty but of highest devotion, the greatest possible service to the cosmos. The great temple of Tenochtitlan embodied this vision. Rising above the city in twin staircases, one side dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the other to Tlaloc, it symbolized the balance of sun and rain, fire and water. From its summit, priests could look out across the city and the lake, watching the life of the empire unfold beneath them. Rituals performed there were not private, they were public, meant to remind everyone that their city was the axis of the world, the place where heaven and earth met. Festivals filled the calendar, each honoring a different deity or cycle of nature. In one month, worshippers honored Tlaloc by offering children whose tears were said to bring rain. In another, warriors danced in honor of Huitzilopochtli, their bodies painted, their weapons raised in ritual combat. Music filled the plazas, drums echoing like thunder, flutes carrying high, mournful notes, conch shells sounding like the roar of wind. Dancers in brilliant feathered headdresses swirled in patterns that mirrored the movements of stars. For the Aztecs, to celebrate the gods was to participate in the very rhythm of the universe. Religion shaped not only ceremonies but also daily life. Every family kept small household shrines where offerings were placed each morning. Farmers prayed to Tlaloc before planting. Merchants carried amulets of Quetzalcoatl on long journeys. Children learned from a young age the names of the gods, the rituals of devotion, and the stories of creation. Education itself was infused with religious purpose. To know the gods was to know how to live properly in the world. The seriousness of this devotion gave the Aztec state both power and fragility. Power, because the belief in divine necessity unified people under a shared cosmic duty. Fragility, because every famine, every drought, every eclipse could be seen as a sign of failing the gods, a reminder of how precarious the fifth sun truly was. For outsiders, this world could be difficult to understand. Neighboring peoples both feared and resented the Mexica for their sacrifices. The demand for captives drove endless wars, known as flower wars, where battles were fought not merely to kill but to capture prisoners for ritual offerings. Yet for the Mexica themselves, these acts were not savagery. They were part of a sacred order, as necessary as breathing. In this way, the gods shaped every aspect of Aztec life. From the rising of the sun to the planting of maize, from the victories of warriors to the tears of children, all was bound to the divine. The people saw themselves as guardians of the universe, chosen to sustain the fifth sun. Their city was not just a capital, it was the pivot of the cosmos, the place where sacrifice kept the heavens in motion. And so Tenochtitlan grew not only in stone and water but in meaning. Each temple, each offering, each ritual gave weight to the belief that they were the people of the sun, destined to shine as long as they fulfilled their duty. For the Mexica, life itself was service. Service to their gods, service to their city, service to the eternal struggle of light against darkness. Theirs was a world of beauty and terror, of flowers offered with gentle devotion and of blood spilled with solemn purpose. To be Aztec was to stand in the center of that paradox, to live knowing that joy and suffering alike were part of the divine design. Part 4. Markets and Merchants. If religion gave the Aztec world its meaning, trade gave it its rhythm. The heart of Tenochtitlan beat not only in its temples but also in its markets, where thousands gathered each day to exchange the goods that sustained life. To step into the great marketplace of Tlatelolco, the sister city that shared the island with Tenochtitlan, was to step into a world of sound, color, and abundance, a place where the wealth of the empire was laid out beneath the open sky. Travelers arriving from distant towns often spoke with awe of these markets. Rows of vendors stretched in every direction, their stalls marked not with written signs but with symbols: a painted rabbit for sellers of rabbits, a fish drawn in chalk for fishermen, a feather for merchants of quetzal plumes. Each corner of the plaza belonged to a particular trade, and the entire space was ordered with surprising precision. The Aztecs believed that chaos offended the gods, and so even their marketplaces reflected order and discipline. The air was thick with sensation. The smell of roasted maize mingled with that of fresh herbs, dried chilies, and cacao beans. Vendors called out to customers, their voices rising above the crowd in melodic patterns. Women in woven dresses displayed baskets of tomatoes, avocados, and squash. Hunters laid out hares and deer. Fishermen offered shimmering piles of fresh lake fish. Feather merchants spread cloaks that glowed with iridescent blues and greens, plucked from tropical birds. The sound of barter rose and fell like waves. Offers, counteroffers, laughter, sharp words, then the final clap of hands sealing an exchange. Currency in the marketplace was varied. Cacao beans were most common, counted carefully into small piles. Cotton cloaks, salt, and obsidian blades also served as forms of exchange. A turkey might be worth 100 cacao beans, a rabbit perhaps 30. Yet barter itself was common, for the Aztecs valued goods not only by scarcity but also by their usefulness. Presiding over this whirl of activity were officials appointed to maintain order. They ensured fair dealings, settled disputes, and punished thieves. Justice was swift. A cheater might have his goods confiscated, or in severe cases, face public humiliation. In a world where reputation mattered as much as wealth, honesty in trade was a form of honor. Beyond daily commerce, the markets displayed the far-reaching wealth of the empire. Tribute poured in from conquered towns: maize, cotton, cacao, obsidian, honey, rubber, and even exotic animals. Parrots and jaguars, monkeys and snakes, all appeared in the stalls, reminders that Tenochtitlan's power stretched far beyond the lake. Tribute was more than wealth, it was proof of dominion, each item a symbol of submission from subject peoples to the Mexica. Among the traders, none held higher prestige than the Pochteca, the long-distance merchants. They were more than simple sellers. They were a guild of travelers who ventured far beyond the empire's borders, carrying obsidian, cotton, and finished goods to distant lands. In return, they brought back treasures that gave Tenochtitlan its splendor: tropical feathers, jade, turquoise, cacao from the south, and gold from the lands beyond the mountains. Their journeys were dangerous, crossing deserts, rivers, and hostile territories. But they traveled in caravans, armed and disciplined, prepared to defend their goods with force if needed. The Pochteca also served another role: spies. As they entered foreign cities and kingdoms, they gathered intelligence on rulers, armies, and wealth. When they returned, they reported not only on the goods they had acquired but also on the strength or weakness of those they visited. In this way, commerce became diplomacy, and trade became the first step toward conquest. Markets were not only for goods but for services. Barbers shaved heads with obsidian blades. Healers sold herbs and offered cures for sickness. Craftsmen mended tools, sharpened knives, or repaired sandals. Musicians played for coin, and entertainers performed to draw crowds. In one corner, slaves were sold, men and women who had fallen into debt or been captured in war. Yet even here, Aztec custom allowed a measure of dignity. Slaves could own property, marry, and in some cases even buy back their freedom. For ordinary people, the market was as much social as economic. It was a place to meet neighbors, share gossip, and hear news from distant towns. Courting couples might stroll the stalls. Families might come together for a day of both shopping and celebration. In the bustle of the plaza, one could feel the pulse of the entire empire. The order of the market reflected the Aztec emphasis on discipline. Special judges sat in designated areas, ready to hear disputes. Inspectors checked weights and measures. Criers walked through the crowds, announcing new arrivals of goods or decrees from officials. Even the loud chaos of bargaining was contained within an invisible structure, a system that made the market both vibrant and reliable. Spanish accounts later described these markets with astonishment. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who marched with Hernán Cortés, recalled tens of thousands of people filling the plaza of Tlatelolco, more numerous and better organized than anything he had seen in Europe. To him and his companions, the abundance was overwhelming. Gold, silver, jewels, and precious feathers displayed as if the gods themselves had opened their treasure chests. For the Aztecs, however, it was simply the daily hum of life, the natural order of a society where tribute, trade, and labor flowed like the waters of the lake. In the evenings, When the sun dipped low and cast golden light across the canals, the markets slowly emptied. Canoes loaded with unsold goods drifted back toward chinampas or villages. Merchants packed away their wares. Families carried baskets of food home for supper. The plaza grew quieter, but traces of the day lingered. The smell of herbs, the faint clatter of coins, the memory of voices calling across the square. The market was the living heart of the empire's economy, but it was also its mirror. In it one could see the diversity of the Aztec world: farmers, hunters, artisans, nobles, slaves, merchants, and priests, all crossing paths. One could see the reach of the empire in the goods displayed, and its power in the tribute laid out for all to witness. It was not only a place of exchange but a place of identity, where the Mexica could look upon their abundance and know they were strong. And yet, within this abundance lay ambition. The more tribute poured in, the more rulers hungered for conquest. Each new subject state added goods to the markets. Each victory swelled the abundance of the plazas. But tribute also bred resentment. For those who carried maize, cotton, or cacao to Tenochtitlan, the markets were reminders not of prosperity but of subjugation. Wealth for some was burden for others, and though the markets glowed with splendor, they carried within them the seeds of discontent that would one day be used against the Mexica. For now, however, the markets thrived. The plazas of Tlatelolco and Tenochtitlan rang with voices, shimmered with goods, and pulsed with life. To walk through them was to feel the empire's wealth in one's hands, to taste its food, to hear its music, to see its colors. Trade, like religion, held the Aztec world together. And as long as the markets thrived, the empire seemed unshakable. Part 5. Warriors of the Sun. From the moment a boy was born in Tenochtitlan, his path toward war was marked. Midwives whispered prayers over newborns, speaking of future battles and victories. Tiny ears were touched with arrows and shields, symbols of the life ahead. In Aztec society, every man was expected to be a warrior, and every warrior was expected to serve not only his city but also the gods. To fight was not merely to protect land or to win glory, it was to sustain the very order of the cosmos. The Mexica believed that Huitzilopochtli, their patron god of sun and war, waged an endless battle against the forces of night. Each dawn was his triumph, each dusk a reminder of the struggle's fragility. To aid him, the Aztec people offered their own battles. Every captive taken, every drop of blood spilled upon the altars, was seen as nourishment for the sun. War, therefore, was not an occasional necessity but a sacred duty. Training for this duty began early. Boys were sent to schools where discipline was strict and lessons relentless. For most, the path lay in the Telpochcalli, the house of youth. Here, boys of common birth were trained in endurance, obedience, and the art of combat. They carried heavy loads of firewood to harden their bodies, slept on the ground to toughen their spirits, and rose before dawn to labor in the fields or march in formation. Teachers drilled them in the use of weapons: slings that hurled stones with deadly speed, bows that could send arrows whistling through the air, and the obsidian-edged macuahuitl, a wooden sword embedded with blades sharper than steel. For the sons of nobles, education often took place in the Karmikak, the school of priests and future leaders. Here, alongside lessons in history, astronomy, and ritual, they were trained to command armies and lead men in battle. Nobility was not a guarantee of ease. In fact, expectations were harsher. A noble's son who failed to capture enemies in war faced shame far deeper than any commoner. The higher one's rank, the greater the demands of honor. Capturing, rather than killing, was the essence of Aztec warfare. While warriors of other lands often sought to slay enemies outright, the Mexica aimed to take captives alive. Each captive meant another offering for the gods, another heart for the sun, another soul to march alongside Huitzilopochtli in the heavens. The ability to subdue without killing, to overpower an enemy and drag him back across the battlefield, was considered the height of skill and bravery. Those who excelled in this art were honored with advancement into warrior societies. The most prestigious were the eagle and jaguar warriors, men who had captured many enemies and proven themselves again and again in battle. Dressed in elaborate costumes, eagle warriors with feathered helms that shone golden in the sunlight, jaguar warriors clad in spotted hides that gave them the look of prowling predators, they struck terror into foes. On the battlefield, their presence was as symbolic as it was practical. They embodied the strength of the sun and the ferocity of the earth, fighting not as individuals but as avatars of divine power. The battlefield itself was a theater of sound and color. Warriors painted their bodies in bright hues, wore feathers that shimmered in the sun, and carried shields decorated with symbols of their lineage. Drums thundered, shells blared, and whistles shrieked like the cries of owls and jaguars. Lines of soldiers advanced in disciplined ranks, their weapons clashing, their voices raised in chants to the gods. To the Aztecs, war was as much ritual as it was combat, a performance before both men and deities. Among the many kinds of wars, one in particular revealed the sacred nature of battle, the Xochitlán, or Flower Wars. These were not fought for territory or conquest but for captives. Rival states, including Tlaxcala and Huexotzinco, agreed to meet on designated fields where armies clashed in brutal contests. The purpose was not annihilation but capture, the harvest of prisoners whose lives would feed the gods. To outsiders, this might seem cruel, yet to the Mexica it was an honorable arrangement, a mutual acknowledgement of the gods' demands. Success in war brought honor and opportunity. A warrior who captured 4 enemies was allowed to rise into the ranks of the eagle or jaguar orders. He might be granted land, fine garments, or the right to dine in the royal palace. His deeds were celebrated in song and story, ensuring his name lived beyond his own lifetime. Failure, however, brought shame. To return from battle without a captive was a wound to pride, a mark against one's family. In a society where honor was everything, such failure weighed heavily. Women, too, were honored as warriors in their own way. A woman who died in childbirth was believed to join the same heavenly company as men who died in battle, for she too had fought with her body to bring life into the world. Both paths, the battlefield and the birthing room, were seen as struggles for the survival of the community, and both were rewarded in the afterlife. The technology of war, while simple compared to European steel and gunpowder, was nonetheless effective. The Macuahuitl, edged with obsidian, could slice through flesh and bone with terrifying ease. Spears tipped with obsidian, darts hurled from atlatl spear throwers, and clubs all formed part of the arsenal. Armor was made of thick quilted cotton, surprisingly resistant to arrows and lighter than metal. Shields of wood and leather bore colorful emblems, while helmets fashioned from wood and adorned with feathers gave warriors the semblance of birds, beasts, or gods. War was also political. Each conquest brought new lands under tribute, swelling the markets of Tenochtitlan with goods. Conquered peoples were required to supply food, textiles, and raw materials, enriching the capital while binding the provinces to the Mexica through both fear and necessity. To refuse tribute was to invite invasion, and to resist invasion was to face the full force of warriors trained from birth to fight as servants of the sun. Yet war carried a cost. For every city brought under Aztec control, resentment grew. Subject peoples bore the weight of tribute and the constant threat of losing their young men to sacrifice. The same system that fed the gods and glorified Tenochtitlan also planted seeds of rebellion. These tensions would one day be exploited by the Spanish, but for the time being, they fueled the relentless engine of expansion. Within Tenochtitlan, returning warriors were celebrated in grand processions. Captives marched in chains, destined for sacrifice. Families cheered their sons, husbands, or brothers, honoring their bravery. Songs were sung in the plazas, recounting deeds of valor. The city itself seemed to glow with pride, for every victory added to its power and prestige. For the Mexica, to be a warrior was to be fully alive. It was to walk with purpose, to know that one's struggles echoed in the heavens, to believe that each battle was a thread in the fabric of the universe. War was not an interruption of daily life. It was the essence of life itself. The sun demanded warriors, and the Mexica answered with unwavering devotion. As the empire grew, fueled by conquest and sacrifice, the warriors of the sun became its spearhead. Their discipline, their faith, and their ferocity transformed a people of wanderers into rulers of a vast domain. And yet, woven into their triumphs was the shadow of fragility, for the same gods who demanded victory also demanded endless blood. To falter in battle, to fail in sacrifice, was to risk the collapse of the fifth sun. For now, however, the warriors marched with confidence. Eagle and jaguar, noble and commoner, they fought as one people under the gaze of the sun. Each step they took, each enemy they captured, carried with it the weight of destiny. They were warriors of the sun, guardians of the cosmos, and the sharp edge of an empire that seemed destined never to fall. Part 6: Empire Forged in Fire. The city of Tenochtitlan had begun as a vision, a prophecy realized in the sight of an eagle on a cactus. But visions alone do not build empires. That required blood, cunning, and alliances. And in the 15th century, the Mexica transformed themselves from a small city-state on the lake into the ruling power of an empire that would stretch across valleys, mountains, and coasts. The first great architect of this transformation was Itzcoatl, the fourth ruler of Tenochtitlan. By the time he rose to power in the early 1400s, the Mexica was strong but still overshadowed by their overlords, the Tepanecs of Azcapotzalco. For years, the Tepanecs had dominated the Valley of Mexico, demanding tribute and keeping lesser cities in submission. But the Mexica had grown restless. They had warriors hardened by struggle, fields rich with maize, and canals alive with commerce. They were ready to break free. The opportunity came when Itzcoatl forged an alliance with two neighboring powers. Texcoco, a city of poets and scholars with its own proud lineage, and Tlacopan, a smaller but strategically placed state. Together, the three swore to stand against the Tepanecs. Their bond became known as the Triple Alliance, a pact of war and tribute that would alter the destiny of the entire region. When war broke out, the battles were fierce. The Tepanecs had long been feared, but their dominance had bred arrogance, and their enemies were many. Mexica warriors surged across causeways and fields, their obsidian blades flashing, their chants rising like thunder. Texco's armies pressed from the east, Tlacopan's from the west. In time, the Tepanec capital fell, and Azcapotzalco's reign ended in fire and ruin. With victory came transformation. The Triple Alliance divided the spoils of war. Tenochtitlan claimed 2/5 of all tribute, Texcoco another 2/5, and Tlacopan the remainder. Yet it was clear from the start that the Mexica would not be content with equal partners. Their warriors were the sharpest edge of conquest, and their rulers were determined to place themselves at the heart of power. Under Itzcoatl and his successor, Moctezuma I, the alliance expanded outward. City after city was brought under control. Tribute began to pour into Tenochtitlan, maize and beans from fertile valleys, cotton and salt from coastal towns, cacao from the hot lands of the south, and feathers of every color from distant forests. Gold and turquoise gleamed in the markets. The once humble island city became a hub of riches, its plazas crowded with goods from lands hundreds of miles away. But conquest was not only about wealth. It was about dominance. Subject peoples were required to send hostages and warriors to serve in Mexica campaigns. Nobles from conquered towns were married into Mexica families, binding them to the empire. Tribute records were carefully kept, and inspectors traveled to ensure compliance. To resist was to invite destruction, for the warriors of the sun marched tirelessly to enforce their rulers' demands. Moctezuma I strengthened the empire not only through war but also through administration. He ordered the construction of aqueducts to bring fresh water into Tenochtitlan, ensuring the city could sustain its swelling population. He oversaw the expansion of temples, making the Great Temple rise higher, its twin staircases climbing like arms toward the heavens. He commissioned laws that regulated tribute, trade, and even personal behavior, binding the people in order as well as conquest. The empire that emerged was unlike anything the Valley of Mexico had seen. It was not a single, unified state but a network of dominions held together by tribute and fear. Each subject city kept its own rulers and traditions, but all were bound to supply goods, labor, and captives for sacrifice. In this way, the Mexica extended their reach without scattering their strength, ruling through a web of obligations that radiated from the island capital. Religion remained inseparable from this expansion. Conquest was framed not merely as politics but as sacred duty. Each new war was a command of the gods, each captured city a gift to Huitzilopochtli. When captives were led up the steps of the Great Temple, their cries echoing across the plaza, the people of Tenochtitlan saw not only human sacrifice but cosmic victory. They believed they were sustaining the sun itself, keeping the universe in balance. The empire's might was not only earthly, it was celestial. For the common people of conquered towns, however, the empire was a burden. Tribute demanded their harvests, their textiles, their crafts. Young men were taken as warriors or led to altars. Markets filled with goods, but behind the abundance lay suffering. Some towns submitted willingly, preferring tribute to annihilation. Others resisted fiercely, only to be crushed. Resentment smoldered in many corners, waiting for the day it might find release. Despite this, the empire flourished. The causeways of Tenochtitlan were crowded with merchants carrying tribute. Canoes filled the lake, heavy with maize, flowers, and pottery. The plazas rang with festivals that celebrated victory, warriors dancing in eagle and jaguar costumes, priests lifting hearts to the sky. The city itself grew ever grander, its temples gleaming with fresh paint, its palaces filled with treasures from every corner of Mesoamerica. By the late 15th century, the Mexica were no longer wanderers, no longer mercenaries serving others. They were masters of an empire that stretched from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, from high valleys to tropical lowlands. The Triple Alliance, born in rebellion against the Tepanecs, had become the foundation of Aztec supremacy. And yet, even in triumph, shadows gathered. Expansion bred enemies. Conquered peoples, though bound by fear, never forgot their losses. Tribute enriched Tenochtitlan but weighed heavily on the provinces. The system was powerful but brittle, strong so long as victories continued, vulnerable if defeat should come. For now, however, the empire stood at its height. The Mexica, hardened by wandering and lifted by prophecy, had forged an empire in fire and blood. Their warriors marched with pride, their rulers commanded with authority, and their gods were fed with the lifeblood of captives. From the marshes of Lake Texcoco had risen not only a city but a dominion, an empire that seemed destined to last as long as the sun it served. Part 7. Rulers and Nobles. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, above the bustle of markets and the rhythm of canals, There stood palaces of stone and plaster. Their walls were painted in bright colors, their courtyards filled with flowers and fountains, their halls alive with voices of rulers, priests, judges, and scribes. To step inside was to enter the world of power, a world where the fate of an empire was decided, where gods and men seemed to meet, and where the weight of responsibility lay heavy on chosen shoulders. At the center of this world was the Tlatoani, the speaker. This title, humble in sound, carried immense power. The Tlatoani was not merely a king, he was the voice of the gods, the supreme commander of armies, the overseer of tribute, the guardian of law, and the keeper of the city's destiny. His word could raise armies, order executions, or summon festivals that filled plazas with music and fire. The Tlatoani was chosen not by blood alone but by counsel. When a ruler died, a group of nobles and priests gathered to select the next leader from among the royal lineage. Wisdom, courage, and experience in war weighed heavily in the decision. To lead Tenochtitlan, one had to be not only noble by birth but proven by deed. The empire was too vast, the stakes too high, to entrust its future to an untested heir. Once chosen, the new ruler was crowned in a grand ceremony. Priests anointed him with sacred water, dressed him in rich garments of cotton and feathers, and placed a turquoise diadem upon his head. Sacrifices were offered to Huitzilopochtli, drums thundered, and dancers filled the plazas. The coronation was not just political, it was cosmic, a renewal of the bond between the gods and their chosen people. The ruler stood as the bridge between heaven and earth, the one through whom divine will was expressed. Each Tlatoani left his mark upon the empire. Itzcoatl had freed the Mexica from the Tepanecs and laid the foundation of empire. Moctezuma I expanded its reach, building aqueducts and strengthening the tribute system. Huitzotl, fierce and ambitious, extended conquests to the coasts, flooding the markets with new riches but also pushing the empire to its limits. His reign was marked by triumph but also by disaster, for he ordered the expansion of Tenochtitlan's canals in ways that brought catastrophic flooding. His name, Water Thorn, carried with it the memory of both growth and grief. Moctezuma II, the last great emperor before the arrival of the Spanish, embodied both splendor and fragility. He ruled with strict formality, surrounding himself with ritual and distance. Nobles bowed before him without raising their eyes. Commoners dared not speak his name aloud. His palaces overflowed with treasures, golden jewelry, turquoise mosaics, feathered capes more brilliant than any European crown. Yet beneath the grandeur was unease. Moctezuma II's reign was marked by omens and fears, whispers of change, and the growing weight of enemies resentful of tribute and sacrifice. Surrounding the Tlatoani was a web of nobles who formed the empire's backbone. They were lords of lineages, stewards of land, commanders of warriors, and judges in the courts. Nobility was both privilege and burden. A noble enjoyed fine houses, servants, and the right to wear cotton garments and sandals of distinction. Yet he was also expected to excel in war, to govern justly, and to uphold the honor of his family. A noble who failed in his duties faced disgrace, for rank brought not only privilege but scrutiny. Beneath the nobles stood officials who managed the flow of tribute. Tribute lists were carefully kept. How many bushels of maize each town must send, how many cloaks, how many cacao beans, how many bundles of feathers. Inspectors traveled the empire to ensure compliance, their presence a constant reminder of Tenochtitlan's reach. These officials, though less celebrated than warriors, were essential to the empire's strength. Without their records and vigilance, the markets of Tlatelolco would not have brimmed with abundance. Priests formed another pillar of power. Their lives were marked by austerity, long fasts, sleepless nights, and devotion to rituals that kept the gods nourished. They studied the stars, maintained the sacred calendar, and oversaw ceremonies that gave rhythm to the year. The high priests of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc were figures of immense authority, standing beside the ruler in guiding the empire's destiny. In their hands lay the knowledge of when to plant, when to fight, when to sacrifice. They were guardians of the unseen forces that shaped life itself. Judges and scribes also played vital roles. The Aztecs maintained a system of law that punished theft, adultery, and drunkenness with severity. Justice was swift, for the rulers believed disorder offended the gods. Scribes, trained in the art of pictorial writing, kept records on bark paper and deerskin. They painted tribute rolls, histories, and genealogies, ensuring that memory itself was ordered and preserved. For commoners, the nobles and rulers might seem distant figures, their palaces walled off, their rituals cloaked in mystery. Yet their influence touched every life. The maize planted in Chinampas was taxed for tribute. The children sent to schools were shaped by laws decreed in palaces. The festivals that filled the plazas with music and fire came at the command of rulers who claimed to speak for the gods. Even in the humblest hut, the hand of the Tlatoani could be felt. Still, the system was not purely oppressive. Nobles were expected to act as patrons, providing for those who served them. Land was often distributed to ensure that communities could survive. In times of famine, rulers were judged by how they protected their people. A generous emperor could win loyalty as easily as a harsh one could breed resentment. The balance of power rested not only on fear but also on the delicate weaving of obligation and reciprocity. This order of rulers and nobles gave the Aztec Empire both its strength and its fragility. Strength, because it provided structure, discipline, and leadership. Fragility, because it placed so much weight on a small circle of men. A wise Tlatoani could guide the empire to greatness. A hesitant one could doom it. Nobles who governed well could keep tribute flowing. Those who abused their power could spark rebellion. The system was grand but vulnerable, powerful yet brittle. In the courtyards of the palaces, fountains splashed and flowers bloomed, symbols of abundance and order. Nobles walked in feathered cloaks, priests in black robes of devotion, scribes with their painted books. Here, decisions were made that shaped the lives of millions. Here, empire was not only commanded but imagined. The people of Tenochtitlan looked upon their rulers with reverence, awe, and sometimes fear. They believed their leaders were chosen by the gods, entrusted with the fate of the fifth son. The Tlatoani was not just a man, he was the speaker, the voice through whom heaven and earth were bound. To serve him was to serve the gods, and to obey him was to keep the cosmos itself in balance. For now, the palaces stood secure, their walls gleaming in the sun, their halls alive with authority. But within their strength lay the seeds of fragility, for power so concentrated, so elevated, could not easily bend. And when storms came, storms from across the sea, this very rigidity would prove both the empire's splendor and its undoing. Part 8. The Sacred Calendar. For the Aztecs, time was not a straight road leading from past to future. Time was a circle, a web of cycles woven together, each turning endlessly, each bound to the movements of gods, stars, and seasons. To live in Tenochtitlan was to live inside this circle, where every day carried sacred meaning, every festival echoed cosmic struggles, and every moment felt part of something eternal. Two great calendars guided their lives. The first was the Zupohualli, the solar year of 365 days, divided into 18 months of 20 days each, with 5 nameless days left over. This calendar ordered the agricultural world, when to plant, when to harvest, when to rest. Each month had its own festival, its own rituals honoring different gods, so that the year unfolded like a great procession of ceremonies. The second was the tonal Pohuali, the sacred count of 260 days. It was older than the Mexica themselves, inherited from civilizations long before them. This calendar was used not for crops but for fate. It was the cycle of destiny, the measure by which priests read the fortunes of newborns, the omens of marriages, and the prophecies of war. It combined 20 sacred day signs with 13 numbers, producing 260 unique days, each carrying its own character and power. Together, these two calendars spun like interlocking gears. Every 52 years, their cycles aligned, a moment both feared and revered. For the Aztecs, this was the binding of time, the closing of one great era and the uncertain opening of another. They called it the New Fire Ceremony, and it was one of the most solemn rituals of their world. When the end of a 52-year cycle approached, dread hung over the city. The people believed the fifth sun might end, that darkness might fall forever. Fires were extinguished across Tenochtitlan. Temples and hearths alike fell cold, and the city lay in anxious silence, waiting to see if the gods would allow the world to continue. At night, priests climbed a sacred hill outside the city, carrying with them a captive prepared for sacrifice. On his chest, they drilled fire until a spark was born. If the flame caught, if it rose into the sky, cries of relief echoed across the valley. The world had been granted another cycle, and torches carried the new fire back to the city, rekindling every hearth, every temple, every heart. In this way, the Aztecs lived in a universe of repeating cycles, each with its own meaning. Festivals filled the months, each dedicated to a different god, each blending celebration with solemn sacrifice. In the month of Tlacaxapehualistli, warriors fought in mock battles and captives were flayed to honor Totec, the god of renewal, symbolizing new life bursting from old skin. In Etzalcoatlistli, they honored Tlaloc with offerings of food, children, and prayers for rain. In Panquetzalistli, the city erupted with processions for Huitzilopochtli, their patron god, as banners and costumes filled the streets with brilliant color. Each festival was not merely ritual but theater. Costumes turned men into gods, priests dressed as deities, their bodies painted, their headdresses rising like flames or feathers. Music filled the air, with drums pounding, flutes crying, and conch shells sounding deep notes that echoed across the water. Dancers moved in circles, their feet beating rhythms into the earth, their motions mirroring the cycles of the stars above. To witness a festival in Tenochtitlan was to see the entire city transformed into a stage of the cosmos, where humans and gods mingled in a single performance. Even the smallest acts of life were tied to the calendar. A child's birth date was read by priests, who determined what day sign and number governed its destiny. A child born on the day of 1 reed might grow into a leader, while one born on 7 flint might face a life of struggle. These readings did not seal fate absolutely, but they offered guidance, shaping how families raised their children and how individuals viewed their own paths. Marriage, too, was bound to the calendar. Families consulted priests to find the most auspicious day for union, believing that the right alignment of signs would bring harmony and fertility. Warriors consulted it before campaigns, merchants before long journeys. In this way, time itself became a constant companion, a guide to decision-making, a reminder that every action carried cosmic weight. The sacred calendar was also tied to the stars. The priests of Tenochtitlan were skilled observers of the heavens. From the tops of temples they tracked the rising of Venus, the cycles of the moon, the path of the sun across the seasons. They believed the gods revealed their will through these celestial movements, and they used them to align festivals, sacrifices, and wars with the proper rhythms of the universe. To live within this system was to feel the world alive with meaning. No day was empty, no season without purpose. The planting of maize, the marching of warriors, the weeping of children, the laughter of festivals, all were woven into the cycles of time. The people were not drifting aimlessly through life. They were moving within a grand design, where the gods watched and demanded, rewarded and punished. But there was a cost to this vision. The cycles never ended. The gods were never fully satisfied. The people could never rest from their duties. Each festival required new sacrifices. Each year brought new rituals. Each cycle demanded renewal. It was a world of beauty but also of burden, a life lived under the weight of divine necessity. Yet the people of Tenochtitlan embraced it with pride. They believed they had been chosen to carry this weight, to serve as guardians of the fifth sun. Their calendars were not chains but bonds, links tying them to gods, ancestors, and future generations. In their festivals and rituals, they felt themselves part of something eternal, part of the cosmic struggle that defined existence. For those who stood in the plazas, watching the smoke of sacrifice curl into the sky, or listening to the drums echo from the great temple, the meaning was clear. Time was not theirs alone. It belonged to the gods, and through service, they kept the universe alive. And so the sacred calendar continued to turn, its cycles binding the empire together, its rituals filling each year with rhythm and awe. It was both comfort and demand, both order and fear. And as long as the calendars turned, as long as the fires were renewed, the people of Tenochtitlan believed the sun would rise again. Part 9. The Splendor of Tenochtitlan. At its height, Tenochtitlan stood like a jewel in the waters of Lake Texcoco, a city that seemed to rise not from earth but from the lake itself, gleaming with temples, palaces, and gardens that floated between sky and water. To approach it for the first time was to witness something that felt impossible, a metropolis of stone and color, home to hundreds of thousands, all built upon islands stitched together by causeways and canals. For those who had known only towns of earth and adobe, or cities of dry stone, the sight was nothing short of breathtaking. The journey began long before one reached the city walls. Across the valley, great causeways stretched like arms over the water, 3 in total, linking the island capital to the shores of the lake. Each was wide enough for 8 horsemen to ride abreast. Though the Aztecs had no horses, they had built them to carry armies, merchants, and goods with ease. Along these causeways lay drawbridges, which could be raised to halt invaders or to allow canoes to glide underneath. Travelers crossing them would see the lake alive with traffic, fishermen casting nets from slender canoes, women ferrying baskets of maize and flowers, priests sailing towards sacred shrines that dotted the water. As one drew closer, the city revealed itself in tears. At the center rose the Templo Mayor, the great temple, its twin staircases climbing skyward, one dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war, the other to Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. Painted in vivid reds, whites, and blues, it dominated the skyline, a mountain of stone in the middle of the lake. Around it clustered other temples, each with its own shrine and purpose, so that the heart of Tenochtitlan was a forest of sacred pyramids. From a distance, they glowed in the sun like the peaks of distant volcanoes. Surrounding this sacred precinct were the palaces of the rulers. Moctezuma's palace stretched across multiple courtyards, each lined with painted walls and filled with fountains fed by aqueducts. Inside were halls where nobles debated policy, storerooms overflowing with tribute, and menageries where jaguars prowled behind stone enclosures, monkeys swung from branches, and exotic birds flashed feathers of turquoise and scarlet. To walk these halls was to walk through a display of empire itself, every creature, every treasure a symbol of the lands brought under Mexica dominion. But the splendor of Tenochtitlan was not confined to rulers. Its streets and canals formed an intricate network, carefully planned and ordered. Broad avenues lined with white plastered houses led toward the central plaza. Canals crossed the city in straight lines, serving as highways for canoes. Bridges spanned the waters, while marketplaces filled open squares with thousands of people. Unlike many cities, where mud and dust clung to walls and feet, Tenochtitlan was kept clean. Sweeps were appointed to clear refuse, and laws forbade littering. Visitors marveled at the freshness of the air, the neatness of the streets, the sense of order that pervaded even the busiest corners. In the neighborhoods, life unfolded with steady rhythm. Families lived in houses of adobe and stone, their courtyards filled with small gardens where chilies, beans, and flowers grew. Children carried water from canals, fetched wood for cooking fires, and attended schools according to their birth. Women ground maize on stone slabs, preparing tortillas and tamales, while men worked in the chinampas or left for the marketplace. From every doorway came the smell of food, the laughter of children, and the hum of daily conversation. The chinampas themselves were wonders. Stretching outward from the city into the shallow lake, these floating fields turned water into farmland. Rows of maize stood tall, beans wound around their stalks, and squash spread broad leaves across the soil. Willows grew along the edges, their roots binding the fields together, their branches offering shade. Canals between the chinampas glimmered with reflected sky, and farmers paddled canoes along them, tending their crops with quiet diligence. From above, the whole system looked like a patchwork quilt of green and blue, stitched together by human ingenuity. Markets were the lifeblood of the city. The great marketplace of Tlatelolco, just north of Tenochtitlan, could hold tens of thousands at once. Here, traders from across the empire and beyond gathered to sell their goods. Cacao from the south, obsidian from volcanic valleys, cotton cloaks woven with bright patterns, feathers from tropical birds, gold and jade from distant lands. The air buzzed with voices as vendors called out, barterers argued, and criers announced rules and decrees. Spaniards who later saw it compared it to the greatest markets of Europe, but larger, richer, and more orderly. To the people of the city, it was simply daily life, a place where food was bought, tools repaired, gossip exchanged, and the wealth of empire displayed openly. Aqueducts brought fresh water into the city from springs in the surrounding hills, flowing across causeways and into fountains and cisterns. Bathing was common, for cleanliness was considered a virtue. Sweat baths, called temazcales, dotted the neighborhoods, where hot stones and steam cleansed both body and spirit. Visitors remarked on the Aztecs' attention to hygiene, noting that nobles bathed daily and commoners often. In this, Tenochtitlan seemed not only larger than European cities but in many ways more advanced. Festivals filled the plazas throughout the year, adding brilliance to the city's splendor. At one time, dancers in brilliant headdresses might whirl in circles, their feathers catching the sun like flames. At another, drums would pound as captives were led up temple steps for sacrifice, their cries mingling with the chants of priests and the roar of the crowd. These moments, solemn and spectacular, bound the city together, reminding every citizen that they lived at the center of the cosmos. Yet amid the grandeur, life remained human and ordinary. Children played ball in courtyards, fishermen cast lines from canoes, craftsmen carved obsidian into blades or polished turquoise into jewels. Couriers ran across causeways carrying messages, merchants set out on long journeys, mothers scolded their sons, lovers met in the shadows of temples. The city was both extraordinary and everyday, a place where divine spectacle and human routine mingled seamlessly. For allies and enemies alike, Tenochtitlan inspired awe. Those who came to its gates saw not just a city but an empire embodied. Its temples rose higher than its rivals, its markets bustled with greater abundance, its rulers sat in palaces filled with treasures beyond imagining. The city itself seemed to declare the Mexica's chosen destiny, the prophecy fulfilled not only in an eagle on a cactus but in a metropolis that rivaled any in the world. When the Spanish finally arrived, their first sight of Tenochtitlan left them astonished. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of Cortez's soldiers, wrote that they could not believe their eyes, thinking it all a dream. Towers and temples shone across the lake, causeways stretched like roads of stone over water, and canoes swarmed like ants upon the surface. To men who had crossed oceans and marched through forests, the city seemed like a vision conjured by gods. For the Mexica themselves, however, it was no dream. It was the living heart of their world, the place where sun and rain were honored, where markets thrived, where warriors were celebrated, and where the gods received their due. To them, Tenochtitlan was eternal, destined to shine as long as the sun itself endured. And in those years, before the storm from across the sea, the city did shine, bright, ordered, magnificent. A city of stone and water, of gods and men, of splendor that seemed beyond time. Part 10. The Arrival of Strangers. In the early years of the 16th century, omens began to ripple through the Valley of Mexico. Priests whispered of strange lights in the night sky. Fishermen claimed to see fiery comets streaking over the waters of Lake Texcoco. In villages, rumors spread of temples struck by lightning without rain, of boiling springs, of voices in the darkness. For many, these were signs that the gods were restless. For Moctezuma II, ruler of the Mexica, they were warnings that something unknown was approaching. Far to the east, beyond the mountains, beyond even the shores of the lake, ships had appeared on the coast. Great wooden structures, taller than houses, carrying pale-skinned men with hair the color of sun and eyes as light as sky. Their arrival on the Gulf Coast in 1519 marked the beginning of an encounter that would reshape the fate of the empire. The Mexica first learned of them through messengers. Traders and allies along the coast sent word inland. Strangers had landed near Veracruz, armed with weapons of thunder, riding beasts the world had never seen. Horses, towering animals with flowing manes and hooves that shook the earth, seemed like creatures from myth. Dogs, armored and trained for war, leapt at the command of their masters, tearing at enemies with a savagery beyond any wolf. Muskets cracked with smoke and fire, spitting projectiles that pierced cotton armor with ease. To those who saw them for the first time, the Spaniards seemed more than men. They seemed, perhaps, like gods. Moctezuma listened to these reports with growing unease. He was a ruler steeped in ritual, a man who believed deeply in omens and destiny. Some said these strangers might be linked to Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, who according to legend had departed to the east long ago and was destined to return. Others believed they were invaders, mortals like any other, come to plunder and conquer. Torn between fear and caution, Moctezuma ordered gifts to be sent: gold, feathered cloaks, and food, offerings meant both to honor and to warn. Yet these gifts, meant as tokens of respect, only sharpened the Spaniards' hunger, for they revealed the wealth of the empire they had yet to see. The leader of the strangers was Hernan Cortez, a man of ambition as vast as the ocean he had crossed. With him came a small force, barely a few hundred Spaniards, but armed with steel swords, crossbows, muskets, and cannons. More importantly, he carried with him cunning and determination, traits that would prove more dangerous than his weapons. By his side stood one who would shape the course of history as profoundly as any warrior, a woman named Malintzin, remembered also as La Malinche. Born among the Nahua people and sold into slavery, she was given to the Spaniards as a gift. Fluent in both Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, and Maya, she became the crucial bridge between Cortez and the peoples of the land. Through her, the Spaniards could speak, bargain, and manipulate. She was interpreter, advisor, and strategist. Some would see her as a traitor, others as a survivor, but all would acknowledge her role as essential in the conquest that followed. As Cortés marched inland from Veracruz, he encountered towns wary of these strangers. Some resisted, only to be struck down by steel and shot, their warriors unprepared for the new weapons. Others submitted quickly, sensing an opportunity to use these foreigners against their old enemies. For the world of central Mexico was not united under the Mexica. It was fractured, with many city-states resentful of tribute, sacrifice, and subjugation. Cortés, keenly aware of this, sought to turn resentment into alliance. The march inland was a spectacle. Spaniards rode their horses proudly, cannons rumbled behind them, and native allies carried supplies in long lines stretching across the landscape. As they moved, they left behind astonished villagers, whispers spreading like wildfire. Gods or men, saviors or destroyers, the strangers were coming closer. In Cholula, one of the great sacred cities, events turned bloody. Cortés, suspicious of plots, ordered a massacre. Spanish soldiers, aided by allies, slaughtered thousands in the streets, burning temples and homes. The massacre sent shockwaves across the valley, proof that these newcomers were not gods of benevolence but men of violence. Yet it also sent a message: to resist them was perilous, to oppose them could bring annihilation. Moctezuma, still uncertain, sent more gifts, still hoping to contain the danger with diplomacy. Gold and jewels were carried along the roads, shimmering under the sun, only to stoke the Spaniards' greed. Cortés pressed onward, his eyes fixed on the great city he had heard of, the city said to shine from the middle of a lake like a vision of paradise. Tenochtitlan. For the people of the valley, the approach of the Spaniards was like the gathering of a storm. Some prayed to Tlaloc for rain to wash them away. Others whispered that Quetzalcoatl had indeed returned. Still others looked to them as allies, a force that might finally break the weight of Aztec tribute. Step by step, mile by mile, the strangers came closer. With each day, the roads filled with rumors, the markets with anxious talk, the temples with prayers. And in the heart of Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma too waited, torn between fear and duty, between faith and reason, between the weight of omens and the demands of rule. The Eagle City, radiant in its splendor, stood poised on the brink of encounter. The strangers were near, and with them came the first tremors of a collapse no one yet fully imagined. Part 11. Alliances of Betrayal. The Mexica had risen to power not only by their own strength but by the submission of countless others. Town after town, valley after valley, had been bound into their empire through tribute, conquest, and the constant demand for captives. In the marketplaces of Tlatelolco, the abundance seemed to tell a story of unity and prosperity. But beneath that surface lay resentment, anger, and wounds that had never healed. When the strangers came, these wounds opened, and the empire's enemies seized their chance. Among those enemies were the Tlaxcalans, fierce warriors of the mountains east of the valley. For generations they had resisted Aztec power, standing proud as one of the few independent city-states that refused to bow. Time and again, Mexican armies had marched against them in wars both real and ritual, the so-called flower wars where captives were taken for sacrifice. Tlaxcala had bled under these struggles, losing sons on the battlefield and to the altars of Huitzilopochtli. Their hatred of the Mexica ran deep, and it was this hatred that Cortés would bend to his advantage. At first, Tlaxcala did not welcome the strangers. When Cortés and his army entered their territory, the Tlaxcalans struck with ferocity. Battles raged across the hills, Spaniards and their native allies struggling against waves of disciplined Tlaxcalan warriors. Muskets fired smoke and thunder, cannons boomed, and horses crashed into ranks of spearmen. But the Tlaxcalans fought on with courage born of centuries of defiance. For days the struggle dragged on, and for a moment it seemed the Spaniards might be overwhelmed. But Cortés was shrewd. He understood that Tlaxcala's resistance was not born of loyalty to the Mexica but of bitterness toward them. Through envoys, aided by Malintzin words, he offered an alliance. If Tlaxcala joined him, he promised, they would be free of Aztec oppression. No more tribute, no more flower wars, no more sons carried away for sacrifice. He presented himself not as conqueror but as liberator. The Tlaxcalan lords hesitated, torn between pride and pragmatism. They had resisted Mexica power for generations, and to ally with foreigners was a dangerous gamble. Yet they saw the Spaniards' strange weapons, their steel and horses, and they considered the possibility that with such allies, the hated empire could finally be broken. Slowly, cautiously, they agreed. The pact was sealed with feasts, oaths, and gifts. Tlaxcalan warriors swore to march alongside the Spaniards, their hatred of Tenochtitlan burning brighter than their suspicion of Cortés. Malintzin, moving between languages, carried promises from one side to the other, her voice the thread weaving the alliance together. What began as battle turned to partnership, and with it, the fate of the Mexica darkened. The alliance bore fruit swiftly. In Cholula, a sacred city allied to the Mexica, Cortés struck with cold brutality. Suspicious of ambush, he ordered his men and his Tlaxcalan allies to attack. Warriors stormed the plazas, cutting down priests and nobles. Houses were set ablaze, temples desecrated. Thousands perished in a single day, their blood soaking the streets of a city that had once been a center of faith. To the Spaniards, it was a demonstration of power, a warning to others not to resist. To the Tlaxcalans, it was revenge, the beginning of long-sought retribution against those who had stood beside the Mexica. To the people of the valley, it was terror, a sign that the strangers brought not only promises but death without mercy. Word spread quickly. Towns and cities heard of Cholula's destruction, of Tlaxcala's alliance, of the Spaniards' fire and steel. Some began to reconsider their loyalty to Tenochtitlan. The empire that had seemed so mighty was revealed to be fragile, its strength dependent on obedience that could now be shaken. For every town that turned to the Spaniards, the Mexica lost not only allies but tribute, captives, and pride. Moctezuma too, hearing these reports, was shaken. His rule had always been marked by formality and ritual, by careful attention to omens. Now the omens seemed darker than ever. Tlaxcala, long a thorn in his side, had joined with the strangers. Cholula, once proud, lay in ashes. The balance of power was shifting, and the ruler of the Mexica, for all his grandeur, seemed paralyzed by indecision. The Spaniards, meanwhile, pressed on, their army now swollen with thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors. What had begun as a handful of foreigners had become a tide, carrying with it the resentment of subject peoples, the anger of rivals, the bitterness of tribute long resented. Cortés had found the empire's greatest weakness, the hatred it had sown among those it had conquered. From that moment on, the war was no longer Spaniards against Mexica. It was the Mexica against much of Mesoamerica, with the Spaniards as the spark that lit rebellion. The betrayal was not only by Tlaxcala but by the very structure of empire itself, for power built on fear can crumble quickly when fear shifts to hope for freedom. And so the march toward Tenochtitlan continued, each step echoing with the footsteps of not only Spaniards but of thousands of native allies carrying with them the fury of generations. The alliances of betrayal had been forged, and with them the fate of the empire was sealed more surely than by any musket or sword. Part 12. Clash of Worlds. The march to Tenochtitlan wound through valleys and mountains, past fields of maize and rivers lined with willows. Spaniards rode at the center on their horses, armor glinting in the sun. Around them marched thousands of Tlaxcalan allies, their banners of red and white fluttering in the wind. Behind came porters carrying supplies, servants with food, and priests with crosses raised high. The long column moved like a serpent across the land, an army that grew larger with every town that joined or submitted. For the people of the Valley of Mexico, the sight was both familiar and strange. They had seen armies before, had watched warriors march in disciplined ranks, had heard the drums and conch shells that announced battle. But never had they seen men clad in shining metal, mounted on beasts that seemed to merge with rider, or carrying weapons that roared like thunder. Some bowed in fear, others whispered prayers, others still cast resentful glances at the Tlaxcalans who walked proudly beside the strangers. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma too awaited news of their approach. The emperor was a man of immense dignity, but in these months, he lived with unease. Reports of omens haunted him, comets in the sky, temples struck by fire, voices echoing in the night. Now came news that the strangers were nearing the city, bearing gifts he had sent but demanding more, accompanied by old enemies eager for revenge. Moctezuma, once so certain in ritual and order, found himself trapped between caution and dread. He sent envoys to meet Cortés, carrying more gifts, golden discs, feathered cloaks, and food prepared with care. He hoped to satisfy, to persuade the strangers to remain at a distance, to acknowledge the grandeur of the empire without stepping too close to its heart. But Cortés saw these gifts not as gestures of diplomacy but as signs of wealth yet to be seized. For every feather, every jewel, every golden ornament was proof that Tenochtitlan was a treasure beyond imagining. Finally, in November of 1519, the two worlds met face to face. On the causeway leading into the city, Moctezuma came forth in splendor. He was borne on a litter draped in rich cloth, his attendants shielding him with canopies of feathers and gold. Nobles walked at his side, their eyes lowered, their steps measured. Moctezuma himself wore robes woven with turquoise and adorned with jade, his headdress rising like the sun. For the people of Tenochtitlan, he was more than man. He was the living voice of the gods, the axis around which the cosmos turned. Cortés dismounted from his horse and stepped forward. To him, Moctezuma was a king of great power, regal and solemn, but still a man to be measured, bargained with, and, if needed, subdued. He reached out to embrace him, as Europeans did in greeting, but attendants stopped him. For none could touch the emperor directly. To do so was unthinkable. Instead, Moctezuma offered words of welcome, his voice calm yet heavy with formality. Through Malintzin, the words flowed, a greeting to the strangers, an acknowledgement of their long journey, and an offering of hospitality within the city. To Moctezuma, this was diplomacy, a gesture of generosity meant to establish order. To Cortés, it seemed submission, the welcome of a subject before a superior. In that moment, misunderstanding lay like a shadow between them, shaping how each saw the other. As the Spaniards entered the city, they were struck by its magnificence. Canals filled with canoes glimmered in the sunlight, markets bustled with thousands of people, temples rose above the plazas. Bernal Diaz del Castillo later wrote that they could not believe what they saw, that it was greater than anything in Spain. Palaces spread wide, their walls painted with colors, their courtyards blooming with gardens. Aqueducts brought water across the causeways, fountains splashed in noble houses, and flowers floated in basins of clear water. It was a city of stone and water, vast and ordered, alive with splendor. Moctezuma lodged Cortés and his men in one of his own palaces, a gesture of hospitality that also allowed him to keep them under watch. Food was sent daily: turkeys, maize, cacao, fruits, and delicacies prepared by skilled cooks. Servants attended them, artisans displayed treasures, dancers and musicians performed. To the Mexica, this was the way to honor powerful guests. To the Spaniards, It confirmed their belief that they had entered a city of riches ripe for conquest. The days that followed were filled with ceremony and tension. Cortés demanded to see the great temple, and Moctezuma, though reluctant, agreed. The Spaniards climbed the steep staircases and looked out across the city, marveling at the view. From the summit they saw the valley spread like a great bowl, mountains encircling the lake, villages dotting the shores, and the city itself shining at the center like a jewel. But when they looked inward, they saw the altars dark with blood, the statues of gods fierce and terrible, the smoke of sacrifices rising to the heavens. To the Spaniards, it was a vision of idolatry and darkness. To the Mexica, it was the heart of the universe. Moctezuma met with Cortés often. Their words carried through Malintzин's careful translations. He spoke of gods and prophesies, of the duties of rulers, of the balance of the cosmos. Cortés spoke of the Spanish king and the Christian God, of alliances and obedience. Each tried to understand the other, yet their worlds were shaped by such different visions that full understanding was impossible. Where Moctezuma saw ritual, Cortés saw weakness. Where Cortés spoke of empire, Moctezuma heard omens. In private, Moctezuma wrestled with doubt. Was this man truly sent by Quetzalcoatl? Was it his duty to welcome him, to yield, to preserve his people from destruction? Or was it his duty to resist, to fight, to protect the honor of his empire? His priests counseled caution, his nobles urged action, but the emperor lingered in hesitation. The weight of prophecy pressed upon him, and in that weight, decisions faltered. Cortés, meanwhile, grew bolder. He saw Moctezuma's uncertainty and sought to exploit it. Soon, he would seize the emperor himself, holding him as hostage in his own palace, a move that would shatter the delicate balance between respect and insult. But for now, the city remained in uneasy peace, its streets filled with Spaniards and Tlaxcalans walking beside Mexica, its plazas alive with both wonder and suspicion. For the people of Tenochtitlan, the sight was unsettling. Foreigners ate their food, walked their streets, stood in their sacred places. Their emperor treated them with honor, but their presence felt like a storm waiting to break. Whispers spread through the neighborhoods, questions hung in the air, and eyes watched the strangers with unease. Two worlds had met, face to face, each seeing the other through the lens of its own beliefs. To the Mexica, the Spaniards were perhaps divine, perhaps monstrous, but surely dangerous. To the Spaniards, the Mexica were powerful, wealthy, and ripe for conquest. Respect and hospitality masked fear and greed, but beneath the surface lay a clash of worlds that could not endure in peace. And so the days passed in tension, each step bringing the city closer to eruption. In the halls of palaces, in the shadows of temples, in the crowded markets, the air itself seemed heavy with anticipation. The strangers were inside the Eagle City, and the balance of empire trembled. Part 13. The Night of Sorrows. The uneasy peace inside Tenochtitlan could not last. For weeks, Spaniards and their Tlaxcalan allies had lived in the palaces provided by Moctezuma. They ate food from imperial kitchens, drank cacao sweetened with honey, and walked the streets under the wary eyes of the people. Outwardly, courtesy remained. Gifts were exchanged, conversations held, rituals respected. But beneath the surface, tension thickened like storm clouds pressing down on the city. The Spaniards grew restless. Their eyes lingered not only on treasures of gold and jewels, but also on the unease of Moctezuma himself. They saw a ruler uncertain, caught between his duty to his people and his fear of omens. Cortés, always watching for weakness, soon acted. With audacity that stunned the Mexica, he seized Moctezuma in his own palace, holding him as hostage. The emperor, who had been carried on litters, whose feet had never touched the ground without carpets laid before him, now lived as a prisoner. He was still treated with reverence, still surrounded by attendants and courtiers, but every decision, every decree, now flowed through the shadow of Spanish control. For the Mexica, it was unthinkable, their emperor captive, and yet the rituals of obedience continued. When Moctezuma appeared on balconies, the people bowed. When he spoke, they listened. But whispers grew. Was he still ruler, or was he puppet? And if he was puppet, then who truly ruled? The breaking point came during the festival of Tenochtitlan, dedicated to Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror. The city prepared with music, dancing, and offerings, as it had for generations. Warriors dressed in brilliant costumes, drums echoed in steady rhythm, and plazas filled with color and joy. But the Spaniards, watching the gathering of thousands, felt fear. They saw not ritual but rebellion, not devotion but danger. On Cortez's orders, Spanish soldiers surrounded the dancers and musicians in the courtyard of the great temple. Without warning, they struck. Steel swords cut through unarmed men, shields smashed against drummers, blood spilled across sacred stones. The music stopped in screams. Warriors fell where they danced, priests where they prayed. What had begun as festival became massacre. The plaza transformed into a place of death. News spread like fire. The city erupted in rage. Warriors seized weapons, nobles shouted orders, and the people turned against the strangers who had defiled their temple. Barricades rose in the streets, canoes filled the canals, stones and arrows rained down on the Spanish quarters. The Tlaxcalan allies, once so bold, now trembled as the fury of Tenochtitlan surged around them. Moctezuma, still held by the Spaniards, was brought to the balcony to calm his people. Weak from captivity, dressed in his royal robes, he raised his hand and spoke words of restraint. But the crowd, once devoted, now saw him differently. Some shouted for him to resist, others hurled stones. One struck him on the head. Whether by wound, despair, or betrayal, Moctezuma soon lay dying, the emperor who had been the voice of the gods silenced in his own city. His death shattered the last illusion of peace. The Mexica rose in full rebellion, determined to drive out the intruders who had slain their people and held their emperor captive. Day after day, the Spaniards fought to survive, trapped in palaces, surrounded by enemies, cut off from water and food. Smoke from burning buildings filled the air, drums of war thundered from the temples, and the streets echoed with cries for vengeance. At last, with no hope of holding the city, Cortez ordered retreat. On the night of June 30, 1520, beneath a sky heavy with rain, the Spaniards and their allies tried to slip away across the causeways. They carried gold seized from the palaces, loading themselves with treasure even as they prepared for flight. In silence they crept into the darkness, horses clattering softly, canoes drifting beside them. But silence could not hide them. The Mexica had prepared. From the shadows, warriors attacked, their cries piercing the night. Canoes swarmed the causeways, arrows and spears rained down, stones crashed from slings. Bridges had been dismantled, leaving gaps over the lake where men stumbled and fell into the water, weighed down by armor and gold. Screams rose as horses flailed and drowned, as soldiers sank beneath the weight of greed. The retreat became a nightmare. The narrow causeways choked with chaos. Spaniards, Tlaxcalans, porters, and women pressed together, attacked from all sides. Some tried to leap the gaps, only to tumble into water. Others clung to rafts, only to be dragged down. The lake itself seemed to devour them, its dark surface swallowing men, beasts, and treasure alike. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who survived that night, later wrote of the horror. Comrades slipping from his grasp, gold glinting as it sank into the depths, cries of the dying mingling with the roar of battle. For the Spaniards, it was a night of sorrow beyond measure, remembered forever as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. When dawn came, survivors stumbled into the hills, blooded, exhausted, many wounded. Hundreds lay dead in the lake, their bodies floating beside shattered canoes, their armor gleaming faintly in the morning light. Horses, once so terrifying, drifted lifeless in the water. Gold that had weighed men down glittered beneath the surface, lost forever. The Mexica had triumphed. For a moment, it seemed the Empire had cast out the invaders, that the strangers who had brought fire and fear were broken. Drums of victory echoed from the great temple, songs of triumph rose in the streets, and the city breathed relief. Yet even in victory, fate twisted. Among the survivors who staggered away was Cortés, still alive, still determined, and already plotting his return. The Night of Sorrows was both vengeance and omen. It showed the strength of Tenochtitlan, the fury of its warriors, the unity of its people when threatened. But it also revealed the desperation of the Spaniards, who even in flight carried ambition like fire that would not die. The lakes had swallowed their gold, but not their resolve. For the Mexica, the night was a triumph, yet fleeting. For the Spaniards, it was a wound, yet one that hardened their will. The clash of worlds had turned to open war, and the fate of an empire now hung on battles still to come. Part 14. The Siege of Tenochtitlan. After La Noche Triste, the Mexica believed the invaders had been defeated. The causeways were littered with bodies, the lake had swallowed their gold, and the survivors who limped away into the hills seemed broken and beaten. Drums of triumph echoed from the great temple, and the city celebrated vengeance. For a moment, it felt as if the prophecy of destruction had been undone, as if the fifth sun would continue shining with renewed strength. But fate had already turned. Among those who staggered away was Cortés, blooded and scarred, yet alive. And survival was enough. For while Tenochtitlan rejoiced, the Spaniards regrouped. In Tlaxcala, they found refuge, allies, and renewed purpose. With them came an enemy far deadlier than steel or cannon. Smallpox, carried silently in the bodies of the strangers and spreading now like fire through the valley. The disease moved without mercy. Those who had never known it were struck down by fevers, rashes, and suffocation. Entire families perished. Priests, warriors, farmers, nobles, none were spared. Even Cuitlahuac, the emperor who had taken Moctezuma's place and led the city through its brief victory, succumbed. His reign lasted only a few months before the sickness carried him away. The Mexica, who had endured wars and famines, now faced an unseen enemy that no blade could strike. As they mourned, Cortés prepared. In Tlaxcala, he rebuilt his army with the help of thousands of native allies eager to see Tenochtitlan fall. He ordered brigantines, small warships, to be constructed in pieces, carried across mountains, and assembled on the lake. With these vessels, he would control the waters that had once been the city's shield. The very lake that had protected Tenochtitlan for generations would soon become a trap. In the spring of 1521, the Spaniards and their allies returned. This time, they did not march as desperate survivors but as conquerors with vengeance in their eyes. Tens of thousands of warriors from Tlaxcala, Texcoco, and other towns marched alongside them, their hatred of the Mexica fueling their steps. Cortés commanded only a few hundred Spaniards, but behind them stood an army vast enough to choke the valley. The siege began with fire and steel. Brigantines patrolled the waters, their cannons pounding canoes and cutting off supplies. On land, the Allies swarmed across the causeways, pressing closer each day. Tenochtitlan fought back with ferocity. Warriors filled canoes and launched raids, striking at brigantines with spears and fire. Women and children carried stones to the rooftops, hurling them down on enemies. From the temples, drums of war thundered, their rhythm echoing across the lake. But as weeks turned to months, the pressure grew unbearable. The causeways were cut. The canals were blocked. Food dwindled, and famine stalked the streets. People ate grass, bark, even the leather of sandals. Water grew foul, disease spread, and the once proud city became a place of suffering. Still, they resisted. The Mexica were a people forged in hardship, hardened by wandering, strengthened by conquest. They fought from rooftops, from canals, from barricades in the streets. They fought with obsidian blades, slings, and courage born of desperation. Under their new emperor, Cuauhtémoc, barely more than a youth yet brave beyond his years, they refused to surrender. His name, Descending Sun, seemed a cruel echo of the empire itself, a light falling even as it burned fiercely. Day by day, the city crumbled. Temples fell, palaces burned, canals ran red with blood. Spaniards and allies advanced inch by inch, tearing down buildings to prevent ambush, filling canals with rubble to cross. The city that had once gleamed like a jewel in the lake became a battlefield of smoke and ruin. The suffering was immense. Mothers wept as their children starved, elders collapsed in the streets, bodies lay unburied in the plazas. Songs of mourning replaced songs of festival. Yet even in despair, the Mexica fought on. Their pride, their faith, their very identity bound them to resist until the end. By August, the siege reached its final horror. Cuauhtémoc and his warriors retreated to the last quarter of the city, fighting street by street, refusing to yield. The lake was filled with wreckage, the air with smoke, the ground with corpses. At last, with his people starving and his warriors dying, Cuauhtémoc attempted to flee by canoe. Brigantines closed in, their sails snapping in the wind, their cannons thundering. He was captured and brought before Cortés. According to tradition, the young emperor stood proud even in defeat. He demanded Cortés end his life, saying, "I have done all I could to defend my people. Take my knife and strike me." But Cortés refused, choosing instead to keep him as prisoner, a symbol of conquest, the last sovereign of the Mexica humiliated before foreign eyes. The siege ended after 80 days. Tenochtitlan, once the shining city of the lake, lay in ruins. Its temples shattered, its palaces burned, its streets filled with ash and silence. The canals that had once carried flowers and canoes now carried corpses. Of the hundreds of thousands who had lived there, only a fraction survived, broken by famine, disease, and war. The Spaniards, walking through the ruins, saw both victory and devastation. They had conquered, but what they had taken was a corpse of a city. Still, to them, it was triumph, proof of their strength, their cunning, their destiny. For the Mexica, it was the end of a world. The siege of Tenochtitlan was more than the fall of a city. It was the collapse of an empire, the breaking of a people who had believed themselves chosen to sustain the sun. Yet even in defeat, their courage endured. The last cries of warriors on the rooftops, the last prayers whispered in temples, the last stand of Cuauhtémoc, these lived on in memory, carried forward through generations. The city would rise again, rebuilt by the conquerors, renamed Mexico City. But beneath its stones, beneath its churches and palaces, lay the spirit of Tenochtitlan, the city of the eagle and cactus, the city of the sun and lake. Its splendor was gone, but its legacy could not be erased. Part 15. Legacy in Ruins. The drums of Tenochtitlan fell silent. Where once they had thundered in festivals, calling dancers to whirl in bright feathers or summoning warriors to the steps of temples. Now only silence remained. The smoke of battle lingered, rising above shattered pyramids and burned palaces, drifting over canals clogged with rubble and bodies. The lake, once alive with canoes and gardens, reflected only ruin. The great city of the Mexica was gone. Yet the story of the Mexica did not end in ashes. Empires may fall, but people endure. Survivors crawled from the wreckage, hungry, broken, but still breathing. Families gathered what they could, weaving new lives from the remnants. The Spaniards claimed victory, renaming the city Mexico and building their churches atop temples, their palaces atop ruins. But beneath those stones, the spirit of the Mexica remained, buried yet unbroken. The tragedy was immense. Hundreds of thousands had perished in war, famine, and disease. The splendor of Tenochtitlan, once the marvel of the world, was reduced to rubble. Its aqueducts shattered, its marketplaces silent, its temples desecrated. The Mexica, who had believed they were chosen to sustain the sun, faced a new reality. Subjugation to foreign rulers who neither honored their gods nor understood their ways. The fifth sun had not been extinguished by divine will but by the steel and sickness carried from across the sea. Yet even in defeat, threads of continuity endured. The language of the Mexica, Nahuatl, survived, spoken by millions in villages and towns. Their foods, maize, beans, squash, chili, and chocolate, remained staples, spreading far beyond the valley to become gifts to the world. Their knowledge of agriculture, of chinampas and canals, left imprints still visible in the land. Their gods, though outlawed, lingered in stories whispered and in rituals that merged with new faith. Cuauhtémoc, the young emperor captured at the fall, became a symbol of courage. Though paraded as prisoner and tortured for gold he did not have, he remained defiant. His name lived on not as the ruler of a lost empire but as the embodiment of resistance. Generations later, his figure would be remembered not with shame but with pride, a reminder that dignity can endure even in defeat. For the Spaniards, the conquest was triumph, proof of their destiny, a gateway to wealth and empire. But for the Mexica and their neighbors, it was catastrophe. Smallpox and war had shattered entire populations. Tribute was replaced by new forms of labor, temples by churches, gods by crosses. Yet within the blending of cultures, something complex emerged, a new world forged from both destruction and survival. The ruins of Tenochtitlan became the foundation of Mexico City, the capital of a new order. But beneath the stones and streets, beneath the plazas and cathedrals, the memory of the eagle on the cactus endured. The prophecy had not vanished, it had changed. The eagle remained on banners and in hearts, a symbol of endurance that would one day rise again as the emblem of a nation. The Mexica world, though broken, left echoes that never faded. In language, in food, in art, in memory, their legacy lived on. And in the ruins of their great city, one could still hear the faint murmur of drums, the whisper of prayers, the cry of warriors who had fought until the end. The fall of the Aztec Empire was not the end of a people but the transformation of their story. They had risen from wanderers to rulers, built a city that amazed the world, and faced destruction with courage. Their empire was gone, but their spirit remained, in the land, in the culture, in the blood of generations yet to come. Tenochtitlan, the city of the sun and lake, of warriors and merchants, of gods and men, had fallen. But its memory, like the fifth sun itself, continued to shine, not as it once had, but as an enduring light carried forward through history. And so, the story of the Mexica closes here, not in silence, but in echoes that still reach us across the centuries. The city of Tenochtitlan may have fallen, yet its memory lives on, in words, in food, in traditions, and in the enduring spirit of its people. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through their rise, their glory, and their fall. I hope it has carried you gently through the rhythms of history, and perhaps left you with a sense of wonder for the voices of the past. If you found peace in this story, I invite you to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. Your support helps us continue bringing you these calm, immersive journeys into history. But for now, it is time to let the story fade, like the last embers of a fire, glowing softly as night surrounds us. Let your thoughts grow lighter, let your breath slow, and allow yourself to drift into rest. Sleep well, and may the memory of the City of the Sun and Lake guide you gently into dreams.